So yeah, Chris, as I was telling you, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Maybe before we dive in, I can let people know how we met, how
Yes,
we
yes.
how we got to know each other. So I met you the first time I think a few months ago during one of the Sunday session of a group, a meetup group that get together every Sunday afternoon. And that group is meant for people to come practice their English as well as their Chinese. And I would say there's half of the group who are like Chinese people coming to practice their English, and the other half, people like us, meaning non-Chinese people who are more interested in practicing their Chinese.
Mhm.
So maybe could you tell me a little bit about how you became interested in Chinese in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sort of a long story. So actually I feel like my desire to learn Chinese has gone back much, much further than my actual sort of beginning to study. So maybe when I was like around 10 or 11, I had this idea that it would be so cool to be able to speak a foreign language. And in school, in Canada, we do mandatory French. So we do like 3 to 6 years of French. And we've chatted before about my French level. It's not representative of 3 to 6 years of practice. And so I felt like I actually wanted to study some sort of language on my own. And Mandarin specifically, I think is super cool because it's very, very different from all sorts of other languages. So even something like Japanese, which has multiple alphabets, it still sort of has to me at least, it still sort of has a Western feel a little bit to it because it has it has the hiragana, it has the katakana, it has an actual alphabet. But Chinese it's all characters and it just feels like extremely different, extremely exotic, that sort of thing. And so actually for a long time I've known that I've wanted to learn Chinese, but I didn't actually start learning it until I was 19. And I want to say that I started learning it sort of for a noble reason, but actually at the time I had a Chinese girlfriend, so that that helped quite a lot. Um, but actually, only a few months after I started learning Mandarin, we broke up. But I decided that like I had really, really enjoyed the process of beginning to learn it, and so I kept on learning it. And that coincided when COVID started in 2020. And in a way, I think that the COVID isolation stuff is actually what got me serious about my Mandarin language learning. So I remember like in 2020 when we were stuck in our homes and I was stuck in a 150 square foot micro studio. There was basically nothing to do but study Chinese. And so that sort of became my full-time job aside from being a student. And yeah, and I guess it went from there. You meet friends and this kind of stuff. So for instance, I have a friend who lives in Nanjing and we would talk every week and practice. Or I got really into C dramas for a while on Netflix, and that was really, really fun. And it sort of became one of those self-reinforcing habits. Yeah.
I see. It's interesting that you mentioned that the pandemic. I remember that in my case, I started learning Chinese before, like a few years before pandemic.
Mhm.
But I it was also very solitary. I was basically just by myself in my room, in a very small room on the Beijing Film Academy campus, and um, and I felt like it was almost a required step to just be by yourself and try to kind of like get familiarized with all these characters and the
Mhm.
basic sentences, and you would want to be go outside and talk to people and practice, but I feel like there's really a moment where you just to need to be on your own kind of.
Yeah, I feel like that's an interesting thing about language learning, and I think it depends on who you talk to about it. So for instance, I know some people have their own methods that they prefer. Like there was a very famous YouTuber named Lao Shu. I'm not sure if you've heard of him before or seen his, yeah, and so his strategy was basically just learn the fundamentals and then it's all conversation, it's all speak to people, it's all be social. At least for me, that has never worked. Like I love the idea of it, but to actually make like significant progress language has always been a very solitary thing. And so you're right. Like I think in a way, COVID is good for that. Of course, it was bad for a lot of other things, but I think back on those days with like a little bit of fondness just because of that feeling you get when you're making lots of progress in the background. Like for instance, I would use the Anki and SRS software, and you're just putting in like three new characters a day or something, but over the course of a year, that makes a massive difference in your ability.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah.
do you remember any of the first characters that you learned? One that was kind of filled with meanings and that interested you or like caught your attention?
Um, I do remember the first character I learned to write. So when I started learning, I spent a lot of time writing, and over time I've lost that ability. But it was 我, like the I, me, myself, that kind of character. And actually, I think it even to this day, it might be my favorite character, just because like it's not too complicated but it looks extremely like it's sort of all over the place, right? Like you look at other characters like Ta, those kind of things, or Ni, and it doesn't look that complicated, but then Wool has all these lines going all over the place. And I think for a lot of people, it's the first character they learn. So it sort of has a special place in my heart. So
Hmm.
how about yourself? Do you remember your first character?
The pronouns probably I remember like taking one of my first class in Hong Kong in 2016. So I'm sure we went through the pronouns as well. And cannot remember when I learned about the raw like breakdown, meaning that you basically have a spare, someone holding a spare, which I found was like super interesting because you would start to understand that it's like the beginning of the identity of like the individual unity in Chinese, which is not such a common thing because
Hmm.
maybe that's something we will discuss after that. But the notion of a collective is so huge in China
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
it's not so common to talk about things on an individual perspective. And I just
Mm.
remember to see this character that was kind of the drawing of someone holding a spear, meaning that okay, if I talk about myself, I kind of have a weapon with me. I have the weapon of language. I have the weapon to fight for myself, or like
Hmm.
all the hidden meaning behind the character. I appealed to me and made me reflect a little bit on the idea of the individual weapon versus like
Hmm.
the rest of the world, I guess.
We actually at the Sunday Chinese meeting, maybe last week or the week before, I was talking to somebody about this idea where in Chinese we have all these different words for like, your aunt on one specific side or your grandpa or your grandma on a specific side or your cousin if they're younger than you or if they're older than you, this kind of stuff. And it's to me at least, it's a very difficult concept because when I think of my cousin, I don't call her like younger paternal female cousin. I just call her Lauren, right? So there's sort of there's this different sense of how you address people, right? Or for instance, we were talking about like you could call somebody 师傅 or something or 师傅 or something like that. Whereas I would never do something like that in English, right? So there are these linguistic differences that I think they affect how we interact with other people. Or 打歌, this kind of stuff where like you're almost endearing yourself to people through honorifics, whereas the closest I could maybe think of that is calling my boss like boss man or something. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you interact with people in China, even like at first I remember like, when you are in shops and you would call someone like a young lady, you would call her sometimes 姐姐, like
Hmm.
older
Hmm.
sister. And for some reason, like it kind of makes sense when you see like a young Chinese male saying 姐姐 to his counterpart, like a female young lady that could be potentially a sister. But then from my perspective, just because I was Caucasian, it became very weird for me to say, hey, hey, older
Oh
sister.
yeah.
It's like, but then that's how society works, and then people are used to, like they won't be shocked if you call them like little sister or like 美女, 叔叔, like all that stuff. It's very surprising first. Like
Yeah.
you feel like you are be talking to them as if they were like relatives and family, but
Mm.
somehow everyone is used to it, no matter where you're from and no matter what your color skin is.
It's nice though, I think. I mean I quite like it because it means like it ties into what you're saying about the sort of individual versus the collectivist kind of thing. It's saying that, we're different but we're all part of the same family, right? And I feel like I mean I've never lived in China. I've never even visited, so I don't really have a strong sense of that sort of relationship. But I feel like at least in North America and in the West, I can say like with my neighbor or with somebody on the street, I don't feel a particularly strong tie to them. So I'm not sure. I don't know if you've experienced something different in China.
Um, on an emotional point of view, I don't know if there is a sense of closeness. Honestly, I don't think so. I feel like now my experience of China was only in like big cities. Like I lived in Hong Kong, then Beijing. So I think when you live in such big environment and people are literally coming from all over China, um, so you don't get this sense of people being emotionally tied or like
Mm,
interconnected. But it's just that on the language level, everyone is saying uh, nin. You don't hear the
hmm hmm
polite nin, and then people will very easily say 姐姐, 叔叔,
hmm
no matter what context. And so I think also people are very more direct. There is a pragmatism, I think, in China that we don't really have in France, meaning that when you need something, you go for it. You don't really waste your time,
In Chinese?
yeah, in
Oh, okay. Okay.
it's and that was a big change also for me, because I think we tend to, in France we tend to be very careful for like the politeness or like how to address something. And in China it's like
Mm.
literally there's no, of course there are other ways of expressing politeness, but in the day to day it's like there's a very pragmatical approach to life and to human relationship.
Ah. It's I am also for the past year have been studying Japanese, and my level is not particularly good, but I feel like coming from a background of Mandarin, it's helped a lot. And actually what you're describing about the sort of French indirect style, in my experience with Japanese, is taken to like the 100th degree. Like, if you have a problem with something that somebody is doing, you would never say like, I have a problem with what you are doing. You would never say I'm unhappy with you. You would instead say like, if you were to by some chance do it another way, it would be good. Like you say something like that, right? It's always extremely indirect. And coming from a sort of Western perspective, it's jarring, right? Because I want to be able to phrase myself a certain way and express myself, but I could understand that if I do it the wrong way, it could be seen as being unkind or not taking people's social status or their feelings into account. So actually, in a way, I feel much more confident speaking Mandarin than trying to speak Japanese, because with Japanese I'm much more cognizant of if I make a mistake. Whereas, for instance, speaking Mandarin, I feel like you can just kind of feel your way through a sentence and people get the idea that you're trying to say, and they don't take offense if you use the wrong term or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, in Chinese, I feel like there's just much more, it's much more direct. It makes me think of one sentence that you may have learned in Chinese. It's like when you are being too indirect or like, beating around the bush, people will say, 你不用脱裤子放屁. I don't know if you've heard
I've
that.
I've never heard that, but
It's like
oh,
doing something that is unnecessary, basically.
hmm.
But yeah, I was talking to someone on last Sunday, and he mentioned something that was also very interesting in regards to that, like the relationship in China, which was that during the pandemic, for the first time, you had like all these business leaders that were not able to get together and to have like these big dinners and drinks and all that stuff, which is even today a huge part of doing business in China. And so it was kind
Oh,
of the first time in recent history that all these people were like really used to every week to do like social interaction and a lot of networking, rubbing shoulders and all that stuff. For the first time, they were all alone at home, and still they had to go on with their business and like make decisions and all that stuff. And he was explaining to me that it was actually a very good news for China because according to him, it had reduced considerably uh, the all the kind of like practices around corruption
mm-hmm,
and all the
mm-hmm,
things that were needed to get to the right place at the right moment.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
because that happened, now the business leaders tend to be much more focused on business decision and not so much on business relationship anymore.
That's interesting. I wonder where that came from. You know what I mean? So for instance, I know that different countries have different business practices and um, you think of different places as discussing how you start a project, for instance. So in Japan, I know that they have this whole concept of the salary man. But we even have a word, it's salary man. So it's very similar. And the whole idea is that you basically stay long after work, and then at 8 p.m. you go out with your boss and you go drinking with your boss and you eat ramen and you do all this kind of stuff and you stay out until 1 in the morning. And then after that, you have to get up at like 5 or 6 the next day and go back to work. And it's terrible for your body. It's terrible for your health. Japan, I think, has some of the worst work-life balance. But this is how you get ahead, right? This is like the sort of societal expectation of you. And so you're either going to be stuck at the lowest level and you're going to not make any progress and you're going to be poor, or you sort of have to play the game. And I guess what COVID has done is it's been a disrupting force in the way of people's lives. So for instance, my job, I work as a computer scientist, and technically my company is in rural Ontario, which is very, very far from here. It's 3 time zones over. And pre-COVID, pretty much all of the jobs at my company of about 5,000 people, we all lived in this tiny town in rural Ontario. And then COVID, they relaxed those regulations, and then people were allowed to work from further and further out. And now I'm personally working from maybe 8,000 kilometers away. And as far as I know, it's not going back. Like they're just going to keep this sort of new style of living. So again, for all of the negatives of COVID, and I do think there were a lot of negatives and it was very disruptful for people's lives, I think like it has made actual lasting changes in the workplace and how we interact with people. One of the major things I've noticed actually is how I interact with people. I think is quite different post-COVID. Like I know other people have had similar experiences, and I'd be interested to know what yours were. But it kind of took me at least like a year or two after the last lockdown to start actually feeling like comfortable again with the standard sort of way of just sitting there and chatting with people because I was so used to this sort of I don't know, like reclusive lifestyle almost, of just being in my own bubble and learning languages and this sort of stuff.
And would you say that now you are completely over this, or do you still have a few difficulties when things get too social?
Uh, I'd say I'm mostly over it. I think at least for me, I'm in my mid 20s, and so I think, when COVID happened, I was 20, 21, something like that. And so I'd at least had the socialization period of like high school. I'd had the first couple of years of undergrad. And so, in a way, really what I missed out on was the last 2 years of undergrad and then the start of grad school. And I think like it's not great, but pretty much any other time would have been worse. Like for instance, I think back on my high school days and I think on how awesome they were and hanging out with my friends and this kind of stuff. And I think back on like my first year in residence in university and how fun that was. And so really for as bad as it was, it kind of picked the perfect time in my life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about yourself? So you said you were just sitting in your Beijing apartment practicing Mandarin.
Yeah, so that was when I arrived. So I think I arrived on in September. I remember it pretty good because it was on September 11th. And so
Hmm.
that was my first time in Beijing. And pretty quickly, in September, you still had like the end of the summer. It was pretty nice and blue skies and stuff. And very soon, I think it was around like beginning of October, like mid-October, you would feel the winter, the Beijing winter coming with like very chilly winds blowing and then the temperature dropping. And because of the geographical situation of Beijing, you get a lot of the pollution that is generated from the north, just
Hmm.
from the Hebei province that is around Beijing, and so all the winds kind of like bring all the dust in Beijing. So around November, December, it's advised to not go too much outside and stay indoor because you often
Mm.
see like very like spikes in like pollution and stuff. So because I had just arrived, I was like, okay, I'm gonna be only inside in my room. I really wanted to, be able to communicate and focus on the characters. And I had set my this goal to be able to read as many characters as I could. And so for the
Mm.
first, I think 3, 4 months, I was basically just in my room learning characters.
And again, like it's funny, I think to a lot of people that doesn't sound appealing, but actually to me, like I like the idea of just spending like a couple of months just totally separated from stuff, working really, really hard on something, and then coming back to the normal world. Maybe that's a remnant of COVID, is I've gotten a little bit of a taste for that sort of process. But there's something almost like monastic, like I'm a monk, sort of just studying and putting all of my energy into one thing and not letting my attention drift. And at least to me, of course, you need some social interaction, but that sort of thing, it's like it's very pure, it's very beautiful. It's for instance the sort of thing, that feeling I experience when I watch like a beautiful movie, or I listen to like a song that I really, really love. It's just like a feeling of purity. So I'm attracted to this idea of just of pulling away from the world, but I kind of have to pull myself back into the real world because I have a job, I have friends, I have family, all of this kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, absolutely. There's this attraction almost like, and then you get sucked in,
hmm.
and then you don't see time go by. But yeah, for me it was perfect because it was also the winter, so it's like the perfect season to just stay inside. And then when spring came, so early 2017, I realized that just because of my progress in Chinese, I would have many people who were like interested to, having me on set for some shootings or like, having me as an interpreter for some
Hmm.
guests coming to school, like all that kind of stuff. So I really felt like it was not only a monacal period of me being recluded from the world, but it was also an investment. And then it
Yeah,
was bringing some very concrete fruits.
I know we're both very interested in Chinese film. Is the actual process of making a filming in Chinese, whether it be a commercial or whether it be a movie or a TV show, is it significantly different than what it's like here? Like, is it faster, for instance, or is there more pressure on the actors? How do the writers work? This sort of thing.
Um, so I would say that it is quite different. Um, even though I don't have so many experience, so obviously it's pretty biased. But from
Hmm.
what I saw, I participated in a feature film shooting in Beijing, and then also another one in Montreal. So I kind of an idea to compare both of these two. And what I can tell you is that in China, um, there is almost like no regulation when it comes to, for example, like work hours. So, for example, like I would receive like the call sheet every day, just like here in Montreal when I was shooting was the same. Like if someone would print it, like one assistant would print the call sheet and bring it to your room, and then sometimes it would be very early in the morning at like maybe 6 or 7 a.m. So this is kind of common with Montreal. But then sometimes we would finish shooting at like 3 or 4 a.m. at night,
Well,
and that would not have any inconsequences. That would just be like, okay, oh yeah, we finished late. Okay, just make sure you know you get some rest. But but there's no rules, no regulation, and in Montreal, like the film that I did in Montreal, it was you would have to make sure that you know you have at least 4 times food delivered to the people on set. You would need to make sure that there is at least 12 hours of complete rest for the main actress in between 2 days.
mhm.
You'd have like all these rules that come from, you know, like the union and all that stuff. So these are almost inexistent in China.
Mm-mm. Well, it's interesting. So, I do, again, I've never been to China, so I don't have any personal experience with this, but of course there's the Jojo Leo kind of thing. Or yeah, I think it's Jojo
Yeah,
Leo, like
Jojo
the
Liu. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the 9 to 9, 6 days a week, which to me is brutal, but I mean it's I guess sort of a different regulation, it's different standards, this kind of stuff. And I've heard at least in the television industry that it can be quite brutal too, because you're pumping out a lot of these Chinese dramas are 50 episode dramas and each episode is an hour long. And sometimes you're pumping up like two of those a year or something. So you've got to be filming like 12 or 14 hours a day sometimes when you're trying to get these done. I mean, it must be pretty brutal, you know?
Yes, it is. But I think that also brings us back to what we were discussing just before with you know the individual
Mhm,
versus collective approach, which means like when you have a shooting in China, oftentimes you will have like two people doing the directing. And so when someone is too tired or when someone needs to take a nap because he's been working like straight for like 4 days, it would just be, you know, laying down on a couch for like a couple of hours, and then you would have someone taking over and then keep shooting, keep directing. So it's also
mhm,
something that is different with the West. It's like you don't have one director's name that needs to be behind the camera to sign the shots. It's like no, you can have someone else taking
mhm,
over for pretty much all the jobs. So it's almost like this big machinery that is unstoppable, and then just
mm.
people try to catch up to it.
So it's more about the product than about the individual, right? It's about actually getting the thing that you're all working on together finished rather than your own individual contribution to the thing.
Yes, I think so. And there's also this idea that you can kind of rest. You know this concept of like sushi. It's like in France, you would never say during the day, "I'm gonna go rest." Like you know, you
Uh,
this 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 very concept of resting is never used in the day to day. You would say, okay, I maybe I need some rest, or maybe you know during the weekend I will take a nap or whatever. But in China, in the culture, sometimes within like during the day, someone will say, okay, 我去休息一下, 我去休息
mm,
一下, and meaning I'm just gonna lay down and you know get some rest.
mhm.
And it's funny because it's like I was like, oh, okay, so I guess you know, see you later, you know. And it's not even like one nap, you know, this can happen anytime. And this can
Mhm,
happen like several times a day. And I'm pretty sure it's also something that can happen during your day at the office. You know, you could say, okay,
mhm.
what should see? Yeah, you go to a meeting room, to take a quick nap, and then you go back
Wow.
to it.
See, yeah, that would never happen. Like, for instance, at my job, I think if I said I was going to go take a nap, my boss would call me up and say, like, like something is wrong, you know? But I'm interested coming from a French perspective because what they say is like that France works, I think from the regulated work week, France has some of the least work hours, right? It's like
Yeah,
32
35.
hours or 35.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's not so different from like Canada or the States or something. But then I wonder if you from going from France where you're working like 35 and then you go to China and let's say you take some tech job and you're doing Jojo Leo and you're working like 60 hours a week or something. I mean, that's a pretty big jump.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. I think it's just the notion of like the jiaban. like the workout, the extra hours that you
Yeah,
do.
overtime and
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that's quite the big difference because in
Hmm.
France you will have to pay at a higher rate if you
Hmm.
want people to do like, extra hours, and in China it's just like common practice. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't think French people are ready for China yet.
So we're not bringing Jojo Leo over to France anytime soon.
Nope. But I was reading this article in a very good newspaper that I recommend to everyone who's listening, which called Six Stone.
Okay.
And oh no, sorry, it was on Yi Tiao, which is like a Chinese publication, not Six Stone, which is English. But yeah, it was on Yi Tiao, and they were showcasing some of the um, places where typically you would send old people, so retirement home, and then they would convert this place for young men and young women experiencing burnout. And
Oh, wow.
it's a real thing. It has become a concept. Like you would think they called it like the 青年 lao what is it called in Chinese again? Lao, I forgot the name. But anyway, you would just go to the countryside, and I think they share
Hmm.
some time with the elders, and then you would do,
Hmm.
mahjong party, and then probably
Oh,
watch movies and get some rest. And it has become very, very popular over the last few months.
that's great. I mean, the fact that people are burning out isn't great, but the fact that they think of these kind of solutions, I think is wonderful. Like, actually, I think one of the big societal problems that we have here in the West is, we think of our nuclear family, and, I have my mom, I have my dad, I have two older brothers, and we're all quite close, but we live in completely different cities all across the continent. So I live in Vancouver. My brother right now lives in California. The other one lives in Texas. My parents live in Alberta. So even as a nuclear family, we're not particularly nuclear. And then over the past like century or 2 centuries, even the concept of the extended family, at least in North America, has completely dwindled away. So, my grandparents, when they were alive, lived in Salt Lake City. Um, they lived in um, Squamish. They lived in like sort of different places all around the country. And it's kind of sad is that we don't have these multi-generational households or these kind of things anymore. So once you reach a certain age, if you can't take care of yourself, you just get sent to basically live somewhere until you pass away. And I actually think that's one interesting thing that's different from China and Asia is often there's more of an idea of living together with your family as you get older and the your kids and your grandkids taking care of you and this kind of stuff. And my personal opinion is that we should do more stuff like that. But maybe again, it's this individual sort of thing of saying, my rights as an individual supersede my responsibility to take care of the people who are older than me. So I'll move away to another place and I'll just ignore my relatives. So at least in China, I mean, I guess there is some aspect of this, but that you can get some socialization between the different age groups. And you can help people who are lonely, who are living in these places, and you can help the young people who are totally burned out of the sort of competitive rat race of trying to find a job in China right now. It's cool. That's the sort of thing that brings a smile to me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it works both ways, like also for the elderly who are like receiving some visit of young people. So I'm
Hmm.
sure that's good. That's gonna cheer them up too. So yeah, to feel like a really good idea to kind of like solve both problems at the same time.
Hmm. What uh what do you What do you think is sort of the main cause of this burnout? Like, is it just the excessive work hours, or do you think there's something with like the Tongping and this kind of stuff? Do you feel like there's, some sort of cultural or societal thing aside from the work hours that's leading to people to just checking out from the hustle?
I I honestly feel like it comes from the fact that there's just too many people. And no matter what you want to do, you can belong to the best at what you do, then you will always be facing competition. And I find that it's not like in the West where you can pretty quickly, if you decide on one area where you decide that you want to be the best in one specific field, and if you set your mind to it, then I feel like you can get to it pretty quickly. There's not that many people who are like willing to put the effort. But in China,
Hmm.
you just have like this massive population, and so no matter what you want to do, you will always be facing competition,
Yeah,
and you will never really be able to stand out.
it's pretty
And
tough.
yeah, so you need to think that you need the competition is not something you can avoid basically. And
Yeah.
so that's why so many young people decide to leave China, and most of the time, like these people are the most talented and the most free spirit and brilliant people, and because they know that they're not gonna make it there, even though they have all these
Mhm.
skills. And so the rest of the people are maybe a bit less talented or maybe less unique, but they have no other choice than just to follow the trend of, like doing this 9 hours a day,
Hmm.
from 9 to 9, 6 days a week, and then spend enough time with the boss and do all the things that are needed to make sure you get the promotion at the end of the year.
Yeah. It says something though about our society that basically to feel like you have worth, you have to be the best at something, right? Like you have to, you have to be like the best programmer to be able to get the job that you want, so that you can make the money that you want and impress people and all of this stuff. We've sort of built both in the Western world and in the Eastern world this idea that you have something to prove by being alive, right? And I think that's sort of one of the negative things about our modern society is even me, for instance, learning languages, I sort of have an intrinsic desire to become extremely good at it, where in a sense I feel like maybe to maximize my happiness, it would be better to actually not be that good and spend, instead of investing a ton of my time into getting that extra small amount of effort or that extra small amount of performance in Mandarin, I could spend thousands of hours doing something else that I love, right? But sort of deep down, I feel like, I'm not good enough at the language yet, so I have to keep putting in hours and, doing things that aren't necessarily fun when you're studying, like studying isn't always fun. You have to, review, you have to do SRS, you have to go over boring transcripts sometimes and these kind of things. And maybe that's sort of a remnant of this idea of feeling like you have to be better, right?
Yeah, it's I think it has to do with the fact that it was never really a problem for humans to have enough resources, but it's
Mhm.
always in the how we share it, like really how we
Mm.
share it. Meaning like there's always this power struggle hidden behind it's like if we wanted to, it would be easy to make sure that everyone has enough food and has a decent work, and that would be possible. But what's happening is there's always like some power struggle that kind of gets in the way of that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's true. It's a cool way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think China right now it's still pretty much a country where you have to kind of like show with your wealth that you are successful. And I think unfortunately that's something that has been that is inherited from the communist revolution of
Hmm.
just breaking all the historical and cultural values from China. And so the new generation just grew up with a very materialistic approach to life. and
Hmm.
uh
Hmm.
and now every Chinese New Year, you go back to your hometown, and you have to bring the gifts.
Oh, yeah.
You have
The
to
red
have the
envelopes and stuff too, right? Yeah.
right. You have to have the nice car. You have to have the luxury fashion goods, the scarves, all that stuff, and
Beautiful girlfriend and boyfriend and stuff too. And yeah.
yeah, the right makeup, the right clothes,
Hmm.
blah blah blah. And so that contributes to just keep, it keeps the wheel going in that sense, meaning like people are not really interested in exploring different ways, which we have more in the West and in Canada
Mhm.
right now, more like maybe minimalistic approach or and a way outside of consumerism. But I
Yeah.
feel like it's a bit too early for China now.
I remember seeing a funny video once of something they call the Beijing bikini. Have you heard of this before? Yes,
Yes.
yes. So it's, where you pull your shirt up basically and you flaunt to your belly if you're some sort of older man in China. And what the idea of it is that, it's a remnant of these communist times where you didn't have the money even to build up body fat and to have a belly. And so it's it's this idea of being fat is a sign of affluence, right? It means that you have enough food to eat. And it's interesting because that has sub per sort of continued even into the 2020s, where if anything, I think our attitudes on that sort of stuff have completely gone the other way, at least in the West, of saying, obesity is something considered more sort of a lower class, and then the ability to stay fit and thin and healthy and have muscles and makeup and all of this kind of stuff, that's the sign of wealth. So it's I guess yeah, there's a different attitude going on in China, right? At least this one remnant has subsisted.
I wanted to ask you to just go back to what we were saying about the US because it's also the right opportunity for me. I don't get to chat with a American citizen all the time. So since it's the first podcast that I do after the win of Trump at the election, there's one topic that I'm always interested to discuss and I haven't had the chance to do it yet, is to talk about the popularity of Trump in China
Mhm.
and to develop a little bit. I feel like if you look at his politics, if you look at what he says, and if you look at what he has said before, I remember notably like the when he was referring to the COVID as the Chinese virus and all that stuff.
The
Like
Kung Flu and stuff. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. He has been and he's still like pretty harsh towards China, toward the Chinese government and all that stuff. And nonetheless, you feel, I mean, I don't know if you feel it, maybe we can discuss that, but I feel like there's a huge portion of Chinese people who are like very like much behind him and
hmm
supporting him. So do you first do you feel that way too? And second, what would be like the main reasons behind that for you?
Yes, yes. So actually, I definitely feel that way, and I see where you're coming from there. And I do actually think there's a reason. So, first of all, when you look objectively at Trump's policy, I think it's bad for China. Like if at least in my opinion, if I look from like a policy standpoint, he's talking about imposing, first of all, like a 10 or 20% universal tariff on all goods manufactured out of the US, importing them into the US, which is not good if you're a exporter from another country because it means basically regardless of if the consumers in America pay the cost of the tariff, it's still going to basically drive the competition away from external exporters and towards domestic industry. And that's kind of what Trump is trying to do. He's trying to revive the sort of, America first industry, keep all of the supply chains in America. For China, that's much worse though. He's talked about putting like a 50 or 100% tariff or something on Chinese goods. And basically the whole point, one of the major reasons why China has built up so much in the last few decades has been because they've been pretty much our main exporter, and we've been their main sort of thing that they're exporting to, and so we support a massive amount of the Chinese trade operation. So this tariff, objectively, I think is very bad. But what I think we're seeing in China is that Trump basically represents internationally a degradation of the sort of status of America. And I think, a lot of it's different inside of America, where about half of America sees him as the path towards redemption of the country and keeping America first and this sort of stuff. But, from the European perspective, from the I think a lot from the Chinese perspective, from the Japanese perspective, Trump is sort of somebody who's a sign of America losing its dominance in the world. And so from China, where this idea of competition is so major, and I think there is a nationalist idea of wanting China to be a global superpower and be taken seriously by other countries and this kind of stuff. I think they see Trump as sort of like the funny guy who's gonna hurt America in a way. That's at least my personal view. Again, I don't sort of keep that much in touch with like the social media, but I think he's basically a opportunity for the US to not be as much of a global player.
Mm.
Yeah, do you have sort of a similar thought?
Um, I was not thinking about that at all, but it's interesting what you mentioned about the different perspective, notably the one from Europe and from the US. Though my perspective on this was mostly that I feel like there is something very like visual about Trump,
Mm-hmm.
the way he behaves, the way he
Yeah.
shows up, the colorful skin and hair and all that
hmm
stuff. And I feel like he really answers to all of the Chinese requirements when it comes to, entertainment and
hmm
I feel like probably people enjoy seeing him, making all this declaration, and
hmm
I feel like this is such a cinematic character that
hmm
I think it drives his popularity from there, and
hmm
um, and I think the reason why American people like him, the reason Chinese people like him as well are probably the same, which is that he's entertaining, he's fun to watch,
hmm hmm
he's famous, he has all these things, but I had never seen the kind of like the counter side of this that you just mentioned, meaning like maybe they see it as a blessing in this guy, meaning that
hmm
if he's in charge, then we'll have more power.
Yeah, or not even necessarily more power, but just, I mean, for instance, his sort of isolationist kind of principles, maybe it just means he won't be interfering with other people's spheres as much. He won't be trying to assert control over the sort of South China Sea kind of stuff. He won't be trying to go into the Middle East, or at least that's what he said in terms of his policy. But I think you're very much right in that. I mean, he is entertaining from like even as somebody who comes from quite a left-leaning background. For instance, I remember the day when he got shot at in, I guess that was June or that was July. And there was that one picture, like after he gets shot at, where it's like his fist is in the air and he's like yelling and there's blood coming down the side of his face. And I remember seeing that and thinking, if I was ever gonna vote for this guy, it would be because I saw this one picture because it was pretty like epic. Just looking at it, like it was like the fate has chosen this guy to win. And I guess it did. I mean, he did win, right? But it's true that he is more charismatic, he's more cinematic than really any of the previous Democratic people, probably since Obama. I think part of why Obama won by so much was because he was able to build up this whole character sort of cult of personality of, yes, we can, like this, he's this glorious man. He's young, he's charismatic, he's confident, he's handsome, it's all of this kind of stuff. And then you have Hillary, which for many reasons people didn't like her. You had Biden. He's kind of old and he's lost some of his fire and his charm and stuff. Kamala, she's a woman, people aren't gonna like that and this kind of stuff. Like, but it's true. Trump and also Trump, he was on Joe Rogan, right? He was on all these, he did like streams with popular Twitch streamers as well. I mean, I guess that was probably part of why he got elected was he really appealed to the sort of alternative generation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what you see coming from for his mandate now is you don't think it's going to be interventionist when it comes to political influence of China. For example, I'm thinking of Taiwan in particular. You think he's going
Mhm.
to keep his priorities in America?
It's hard to say. So when you've looked at when I've looked at his rhetoric in terms of other places, he said he's not going to be that interventionist. So I mean, I think, for instance, when he in on January 20th, when he takes office, he's talked about he's going to stop the Ukraine-Russia war in like a day, is sort of what he said. And I guess you could consider that as interventionist, but it's not interventionist in the sense of we're going to supply arms or we're going to do embargoes, these sort of long-term economic interventions. It's more like we're going to shut this down right away because basically I don't want this kind of stuff going on over here, and then I'm just going to pull back to my part of the field. I think in terms of, China's influence, I think, Biden's administration is more interested again in doing these kind of things like subtly trying to influence China, whereas I think Trump's thing is we're not going to try and influence China through these kind of things. We're just going to sort of leave a very vague policy. We're not going to say anything about what we're going to do about Taiwan and China and this kind of stuff. And perhaps from a Chinese perspective, that's good. I'm not so sure. Yeah.
Yeah, time will tell.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you maybe about some of the movies, Chinese movie that you would
Mm.
like to recommend, or some of the it can be pretty much anything, but yeah, if you want to share something that you have discovered while learning Chinese, that would be awesome.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we've talked about 大象席地而坐 before, an elephant
Right.
sitting still. To me, that's there was a time in my life, maybe a few years ago, where that was my favorite movie, and I've seen it maybe three times, something like that, which is it doesn't sound like that much, but considering it's a 4 hour movie, that's like six or seven regular movies worth of watching. So to me, that movie is really, really beautiful because it portrays something very, very different than what my typical life experience is. R- Whether or not that's actually indicative of what it's trying to represent, this sort of um, not exactly poor, but kind of lonely aspect of living in this city in China. Whether that's actually truthful or not, I'm not sure because I've never lived there. But to me, it's very beautiful because it's so different. It's so different from my life. Um, so I love that movie. We've talked about Be Gone before,
Mhm.
right? And
Yes, we
Kylie
can.
Blues and Long Day's Journey into Night, which I think is they're both beautiful. They're both very different, but from a sort of filmography perspective, they're incredible. Doing these long, continuous takes, and again, exposing me to things that I've never seen in my life. And so for instance, I think about the 2008 Beijing Olympics, and it's built to show all of this like the grandeur of China, like the performances with 1 million people in a stadium, and Beijing is beautiful and sparkling and that sort of thing. Personally, that's not what I want to see. I'm not really at all interested in that kind of stuff. I'm interested in that soft underbelly of China. I'm like the poor sort of average life if you live in the rural areas. It's very beautiful. And again, it ties in with that sort of directness of the experience of these people just trying to live their lives and enjoy what pleasures they have like in these different areas. It's absolutely fascinating to me. So those are sort of the mainland movies that I like the most, but my actual favorite movies are Taiwanese movies.
Mm,
So I don't know if you know like Edward Yang.
of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's perhaps my favorite director of all time. So what I actually finished last weekend was Edward Yang was the first director where I've ever watched every single one of his movies. Um, so he has 12 movies out. And just last week, I finished finally the final one called Duckweed, which was sort of like this TV made for TV movie from like the 80s. To me, he is like endlessly watchable, and it's for a similar reason as these other Chinese directors, but instead it's showing that 70s, 80s, 90s sort of Taiwan experience where it seems almost American, except they're speaking in Taiwanese or speaking in Mandarin, Taiwanese Mandarin. And it's just so fascinating. People are wearing these big oversized white t-shirts. They're wearing those baggy jeans. They're riding motorcycles. They've got their hair slicked back. I I've watched some of Edward Young's movies probably, 5 or 6 times, like Yi Yi or A Brighter Summer Day and these kind of things. Have you watched him before?
I've watched Yi Yi when
Hmm.
I was in China, and I also absolutely loved it. It was he has such a unique way of filming and storytelling in it.
He's great. And then there's some other Taiwanese directors like Ho Xiaoxian. I really recommend him. He's got some great movies, like A City of Sadness. And Tsai Ming Liang, he's very famous. He does sort of slow cinema kind of stuff. So at least for me, that's probably my favorite movie region and will continue to be.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put down the all the notes of the title of the movies and I'm sure that the people will enjoy like discovering some of these movies.
Yeah, well, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to chat. I think, I always enjoy chatting together. I feel like we kind of get to the heart of a lot of the topics, which is it's very fun to me and to meet somebody else who has gone through the process of trying to learn Chinese and all the ups and downs that are associated with that. So, yeah, it was my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, there are so many other things that we could discuss, but maybe that'll be for another episode.
Yeah. Sounds good.